The queue was 4,400 names long when I came in that morning, and it had grown to 4,800 by the time I finished my first cup of station coffee. I want to be precise about that. Not 4,800 souls, not 4,800 refugees, not 4,800 of the displaced and the desperate, though all of those things were true. 4,800 individual transit applications, each one a form in triplicate, each one with a reference number, each one requiring a biometric packet, a species health declaration, a point of origin verification, and a birth assignment drawn from an allocation pool that the Consolidated Relief Directorate had capped at 300. 300. I had 300 approved berths on the UAEN Combined Transport Manifest for the entire Velhari Outer Drift Resettlement Corridor, and I had 4,800 applications in my queue before the station's morning shift had properly started, and the number climbing at the bottom of my screen was not slowing down. My name is Sira Callhound. At the time of the events I am describing, I held the rank of Senior Allocation Clerk, Grade 7, Consolidated Relief Directorate, Caravan Station. I want to be very clear about that grade. Grade 7. Not a director, not a deputy commissioner, not a policy officer with mandate authority. A clerk. A person whose job was to match bodies to berths, verify documentation, stamp manifests, and forward approved packets to the Transport Coordination Desk 3 floors below mine. I am writing this now because someone asked me to write it, and because I am old enough that if I do not write it now it will not get written, and because 11,212 Velhari are alive in the caravan resettlement zones right now who might want to know someday how their names ended up on those manifests. So the queue. The Velhari are, I should say something about who they are, because the briefings at the time were thin and the public record is thinner. They are an arthropoid people. Six-limbed, bilaterally symmetrical, with a soft exoskeletal plating that runs from a deep blue-gray at the crown of the head to a lighter slate silver along the underbody. Wide amber eyes, compound-structured, that catch light at angles human eyes do not. They were, for several centuries before the Kethvaz consolidation began its push into the outer drift, one of the more accomplished navigational species in that corridor. The transit lanes through the Velhari expanse were their charts, their legacy, the accumulated astronomical work of 40 generations. The Kethvaz did not want the lanes. They wanted the expanse. The Velhari were, in the language of the Kethvaz administrative filing that I pulled from the open record on my second morning at that job, an occupational impediment to resource survey operations. Not a people, an impediment. The filing was stamped and archived, and no member of the Galactic Relief Compact had objected to it in the 18 months since it was entered. That was the world the 4,800 applications were coming from. The Kethvaz consolidation had begun burning transit corridors 4 months before I arrived at Caravan Station, not burning in the metaphorical sense. The Velhari word for what happened to the corridor stations translates most closely as rendered uninhabitable by thermal event. The compact called it infrastructure disruption. I called it nothing officially because my job was allocation and documentation, not political classification. What I did was open the queue each morning, read the numbers, and begin stamping. On the first day, I stamped 41 applications approved and forwarded them to Transport Coordination. 41 out of 4,800. The berths were real, the transports were real, and the 41 families whose packets I pushed through that morning were real. I felt, as I recall, a specific and entirely useless combination of competence and futility. The feeling of bailing a flooding compartment with a standard-issue ladle, and doing it correctly, and knowing that the water is rising faster than the ladle moves. That evening, I stayed 3 hours past shift end reading the Directorate's allocation protocols. Not because I had been asked to, because there was a thing I had noticed in the queue, and I wanted to understand whether what I was noticing was real. It was real. The compact's allocation cap of 300 berths applied to approved civilian transit, Category 1, standard family resettlement, but the protocols distinguished 6 categories of transit authorization. Category 1 was the one with the cap. Categories 2 through 6 had different authorities, different paperwork, different processing chains, and in several cases, different or absent caps. Category 3 was medical evacuation, no numerical cap, authority granted to any grade 5 or above who could certify a medical necessity. Category 4 was skills-based humanitarian transfer, capped at 50 per quarter, but with a provision for director override. Category 5 was unaccompanied minor transit, also uncapped, with a separate berth pool drawn from the station's emergency reserve rather than the standard allocation manifest. Category 6 was, and this is the one I sat looking at for a very long time, mass displacement emergency resettlement, triggerable by any grade 7 or above, when documented evidence of species-level displacement met 3 specific criteria, at which point the standard berth cap was automatically suspended pending review by the Regional Humanitarian Board, which met quarterly, which meant a review timeline of up to 90 days, which was 90 days in which the cap was suspended, and the allocation authority reverted entirely to the triggering clerk's judgment. I pulled up the 3 criteria. I read them twice. I read the Velhari Compact filing again. I cross-referenced the Keth Vaz thermal event reports with the displacement documentation that had come in with the applications. I made a table because I make tables when I am thinking through a problem. The table had 3 columns: the criterion, the required evidence standard, and the evidence actually in the queue. All 3 criteria were met. They had been met by my reading for at least 6 weeks, which meant that any grade 7 at any compact-affiliated station who had read the same documents I was reading should have triggered Category 6 42 days ago. Nobody had. I checked the regional record. No trigger had been filed. The allocation cap of 300 had been sitting on top of 4,800 applications for 6 weeks because no one had moved the cap. I filed the Category 6 trigger at 23:14 station time. I sent copies to the regional board, to the directorate's compliance office, to my station chief, and to the transport coordination desk. Then I went back to the queue and started working. My station chief, Deputy Commissioner Havern, called me at 7:30 the next morning. He was a careful man, Havern careful in the way that people who have held institutional positions for a long time become careful, which is to say that his caution had been refined by years of practice into something almost artistic. He told me the trigger was a significant action. He told me it had implications. He told me the regional board would need time to assess it. He told me that in the interim, pending board review, I should continue processing under the existing allocation guidelines. I told him I understood. I then processed 114 applications before lunch, drawing on the Category 3 medical authority for the 61 whose health documentation showed conditions that could reasonably be classified as requiring expedited transfer, drawing on the Category 5 pool for the 17 unaccompanied minors in the queue, and flagging the remaining 36 as Category 1 standard approvals against the original manifest. By afternoon, I had exhausted the Category 1 berths entirely. Then I called the Transport Coordination Desk and asked about the station's mothballed transport reserve. The transport coordinator was a man named Oris Venn, who had been doing his job for 11 years, and who regarded sudden questions from allocation clerks about mothballed reserve transports the way experienced engineers regard sudden questions from passengers about emergency hatches. He asked me why I was asking. I told him I had filed a Category 6 trigger, and that pending the board review I had allocation authority that potentially exceeded the current manifest. He asked me if I had director authorization to activate reserve transports. I told him that the Category 6 provision did not require director authorization. It required Grade 7 authorization, which I had. There was a silence on the line. "How many?" he said. I looked at my queue. I looked at the number of applications. I did the arithmetic. "Everything you've got on reserve," I said, "and find out what's sitting idle at Corridor 7. Then activated 7 transports that afternoon. 2 of them needed inspection before they could be cleared for live transit. I had the inspection team out by 1600. Both cleared by end of shift. This is the part of the account that people, when they hear it, expect to be dramatic. In my memory, it was not dramatic. It was administrative. I had a queue. I had newly available berths. I had applications with complete documentation, and I began matching them. The matching is a skill. You learn, after time, how to read a packet quickly, how to spot the documentation that needs a secondary check, how to identify the packets that will slide straight through, how to sequence the approvals so the most vulnerable families clear first. I was good at it. I had been doing it for 9 years before Caravan in various postings, and I was very good at it by the time I arrived here. What changed in those first 3 days after the Category 6 filing was scale. The number of viable berths climbed faster than I had anticipated because the mothballed reserve at Corridor 7 turned out to be larger than Venn had initially said. 19 additional transports, 13 of which cleared inspection within 48 hours. I worked through the Q night shift and day shift, eating at my desk, sleeping 4 hours at a time on the cot I had requisitioned from the station's emergency supply locker. My assistant, a young man named Dav Crescent who was Grade 3 and had been assigned to Caravan 6 weeks earlier for what he had assumed would be a routine posting, came in at the start of what should have been his day off and asked if I needed help. I put him on the health declaration verification stack. The Velhari began arriving at Caravan Station, docking bay on the 4th day. I had seen the species in documentation, photographs in the transit applications, medical photographs in the health declarations, the standard biometric captures. I had not been at a docking bay when a Velhari transport came in. The first one that cleared for approach was a converted freight hauler, a Velhari vessel that had been pressed into family transit by whoever was organizing the evacuation on the other end. It was running on partial power. The docking approach was ragged. I was not at the bay, I was at my desk, but Dav came back afterward and told me about it, and his face had the look of someone who had seen something they were not certain they had language for yet. He said they were quiet, not frightened quiet or subdued quiet, just quiet. He said they moved with a kind of deliberate care, each adult keeping 2 of their 6 limbs in contact with at least one child at all times. He said the amber eyes were, he used the word, enormous. He said they looked at the Caravan Station dock and at the human station personnel and at the transfer queues with an expression he could only describe as trying to understand if this was real. "Are we doing right by them?" he asked me. I told him to get back to the health declarations. But I thought about the question. I thought about it that evening when the queue had ticked down to 3,200 and then back up to 3,600 because new applications were coming in faster than I was clearing the existing ones, because the Velhari convoy routes that had been burning for months were being systematically closed and the displacement was accelerating. I thought about the question, and I thought about the 3 criteria, and I thought about the 42 days the cap had been sitting over the queue while the corridor stations burned, and I made a decision that was not strictly within the scope of my allocation authority. I called the UA and Medical Corps liaison. The Meridian Covenant was a hospital ship, a proper one, not a transport with a medical bay attached. It was in Corridor 7, assigned to a different relief operation, and it had not been included in any of the Velhari allocation planning because nobody had planned the Velhari allocation at the scale I was now operating. I told the medical corps liaison that I had a mass displacement event under Category 6 authority, and that I had a minimum of 300 applications flagged for Category 3 medical priority, genuine medical priority, not reclassifications, and that my current transport manifest had no adequate medical capacity for those cases. The liaison asked if the request had director approval. I told him that Category 6 mass displacement transferred temporary humanitarian allocation authority to the filing clerk, and that I was the filing clerk, and that I was formally requesting the Meridian Covenant be added to the Caravan Station Resettlement Corridor Manifest. He told me he would need to check with his chain of command. I said I understood, and I sat at my desk and I continued stamping applications, and 3 hours later the Meridian Covenant's docking notification came through to my terminal. I added it to the manifest. I forwarded the updated manifest to Ven. I sent a copy to the regional board, to Havern's office, and to the compliance officer. Deputy Commissioner Havern called me again the following morning. This call was longer than the first one. He used the phrase scope of authority 4 times and the phrase board review process 3 times and the phrase significant concern twice. He told me that my Category 6 filing was under active assessment, and that pending the outcome of that assessment, I should be aware that actions taken under that authority were subject to potential reversal. I told him I understood. He asked me to prepare a full accounting of all actions taken under the Category 6 claim for submission to the regional board. I said I would have it ready within 24 hours. He said the assessment would likely, he used likely carefully, conclude that the trigger was valid, but that the scope of asset deployment may have exceeded what the provision was designed to authorize. And the families, I asked, the ones already processed? He said that placements already completed would almost certainly stand regardless of the assessment outcome. I thanked him and ended the call and looked at my queue. It was 2,900 names. I worked faster. This is the thing I want to try to explain, because I think it is the thing that is hardest to convey. I was not, during those weeks, operating from a feeling of heroism. I was not conscious of any grand moral clarity. What I was conscious of was the queue. The queue had a number at the top and a number at the bottom, and the gap between them was the work, and the work was specific and granular and detail-dependent in the way that the administrative work I had been doing for 9 years was specific and granular and detail-dependent. Each application had a name. Each name had a biometric packet and a health declaration and a point-of-origin code and a family grouping code. The family grouping code was important. You could not separate family groups across transport assignments if you could avoid it. The Velhari family structure was multi-generational, and the adults who came in together had dependent relationships that the biometric clusters made clear. You had to read the clusters. You had to assign them to the same ship, the same dock. I knew this because I was good at my job, and I did it because it was my job to do it, and also because somewhere under the work, not above it, not beside it, but underneath it, load-bearing, was the fact that the names in the queue were Velhari families whose corridor stations were burning. There is a thing that happens in allocation work when the volume is very high and the pace is sustained for many days. You develop a granular familiarity with the documentation that is something between reading and recognition. A packet comes up on your screen, and you are already processing it before you have consciously identified what you are looking at. The eye has learned the shape of a complete biometric cluster, the specific field arrangement of a Category 3 health flag, the point-of-origin codes for the corridor stations you have processed most often. The stations had names in Velhari that Sorvith had begun writing out in transliteration for me early in the second week, so that I could recognize them by sight. Drevon 4, Velsarith 1, the Orath stations, the transit waypoints of the old Outer Drift navigational network, each one a community that no longer existed. I learned to recognize those codes the way you learn to recognize the name of a familiar city on a map, instantly, without labor. And with each one I recognized, I knew, without having to look it up, what it meant. This family came from a station that had been rendered uninhabitable, that was gone, that was not there anymore. This family's home is on this manifest because it is the only thing left of where they were from. The regional board's preliminary assessment arrived on day 11. It held the category 6 trigger valid. It noted irregularities in the scope of asset deployment and potential overreach in the Meridian Covenant requisition, and said the matter was referred to a fuller review at the next quarterly session. It did not rescind the deployments. It did not freeze the manifest. It said, in the careful language of a body that had not expected to be presented with an 11,000 birth fait accompli, and was doing its best to process that surprise with institutional dignity, that operations currently underway should proceed in the interest of avoiding humanitarian disruption, pending full review. I forwarded the assessment to Venn and told him to keep the ships running. On day 13, the Keth Vaz Consolidation sent a communication directly to Caravan Station's administrative office. It was addressed to the station commander, not to me, and I saw it because the station commander forwarded it to Havern and Havern forwarded it to me with a note that said, for awareness. The communication characterized the Velhari resettlement operation as an unauthorized interference in a classified resource survey zone, and requested that Caravan Station cease intake operations for all Velhari transit applicants effective immediately. I read it once, I filed it in the documentation record, I went back to the queue. Havern called me about it the following morning. His voice had a quality I had not heard from him before, not alarm exactly, but a kind of density that was new. He told me the Keth Vaz communication was significant, and that the station legal office was reviewing our exposure. I told him I understood. He asked me if I intended to pause intake pending the legal review. I told him that no compact provision granted the Keth Vaz Consolidation Authority over UAEN humanitarian operations in corridor space, and that absent a compact-level instruction to pause, instruction which would need to come from the relief coordinator's office, not from a Keth Vaz communication, I intended to continue processing. There was a pause. Colhoun, he said. Yes. You are a grade 7 allocation clerk. Yes. The Keth Vaz Consolidation is a Tier 2 compact signatory, with a standing fleet presence in the outer drift. I know what they are. You're not concerned. I thought about the queue numbers. I thought about the thermal event reports. I thought about the compact filing that called 4,800 families an occupational impediment. I'm concerned about the queue, I said. The Keth Vaz can write what they like. He was quiet for a moment. The legal office will send you a memo, he said finally. Acknowledge receipt when it arrives. I acknowledged receipt when it arrived. The memo said, in careful legal language, that Caravan Station's legal exposure from continuing intake operations was manageable, subject to documentation of applicable protocol authority. I already had the documentation. I sent them a copy. I went back to the queue. The Velhari convoys came in a rhythm after that. 3 or 4 a day, some of them UAEN flag transports, some of them Velhari converted freighters, some of them the worst-looking vessels I had ever seen a docking clearance granted to, hulls that had been patched with materials that did not match the original plating, engine manifolds running at fractions of rated efficiency, life support systems that Caravan's docking inspectors flagged for immediate attention the moment the airlocks opened. I had 2 engineering teams on permanent docking bay duty by the second week. The Velhari, when they came off those ships, moved through the transfer queues with the same quiet deliberateness that Dav had described from the first arrival. But there was something else in it now. something I started to be able to read over successive days of watching the bay feeds on the secondary monitor I had set up at my desk. The adults, when they cleared the airlock and stepped onto the station dock, would stop, just for a moment. A full stop, all 6 limbs in contact with the deck, amber eyes moving across the space, the height of the transit bay ceiling, the width of the dock, the lights, the human station personnel in their gray CRD jackets, and then something would shift in the way they held themselves. Not relaxation, not relief, something more specific than either of those, like a calculation being completed, like a certainty that had been suspended for a very long time being gently, carefully set down. I mentioned it to Dav. He said they keep doing that, the first solid deck step, every single one. He had been watching it too. The processing rhythm that developed over those weeks was built from small learned details. The bay lighting was one of them. I had the station facilities team boost the transit bay illumination to the upper end of human visible spectrum, which matched more closely to the Velhari photoreceptor range and made the space more clearly readable to them when they came through the airlocks. The documentation tables were another. The standard UAEN processing setup had the documentation clerk seated, which put their eye level below the average Velhari shoulder height and required the adults to angle downward to make eye contact. Dav suggested we shift to standing tables after the first convoy. It was a small thing. It changed the whole quality of the interaction. He was like that, he noticed things. I had thought when he was first assigned to me that he was too young for a posting that required judgment, and I had been wrong. He noticed things and then he changed what could be changed without waiting to be asked. He came to my desk on day 14 with a question I had not expected. "The cluster codes," he said. "The family grouping codes in the packets. I've been tracking them across convoys. And some of the clusters are incomplete. I know. There are adults arriving on separate ships who have the same cluster identifier. They're from the same family units, but they got separated in the corridor. Some of them don't know where the other members of their cluster are." I knew this. It was in the data. It was the part of the data I had not found a protocol provision for, because the allocation system was designed to move people, not to locate them. And the locating was a separate function managed by a separate office with a separate chain of command. "The Family Registry Office," I said. "That's who handles reunification coordination." "Their intake is 6 weeks backed up," Dav said. "I checked." Of course it was. "I can run the cross-reference myself," he said. "The cluster codes are all in the packets. If I build a lookup table, I can flag the incomplete clusters as they come in and start matching them against arrivals. It's not fast, but it's something." I looked at him. He was 24 years old and had been assigned to a routine posting 6 weeks ago. "That's not in your job description," I said. "No," he said. "Do it," I said. He did it. He built the lookup table over the next 2 nights, staying late, working on his secondary monitor while we both ran the queue. By day 16, he had matched 63 incomplete cluster members with arrivals already processed and sent reunification notifications to the Resettlement Coordination Office. By day 22, the number was over 400. The Resettlement Coordination Office sent us a formal commendation, which I filed in the documentation record and forgot about, and which Dav kept a copy of because he was young enough to still want a copy of such things. On day 16, one of the Velhari family group leads. The records designated him as Veth Oron, Family Cluster 7 Alpha, Point of Origin Velhari Station Drevon 4, a corridor station that according to my records had been rendered uninhabitable 11 weeks earlier, requested a meeting with the allocation officer of record. That was me. He came to my office with an interpreter, a young Velhari woman whose standard was careful and precise, and who introduced herself as Sorvith, and told me She had learned standard from CRD educational materials 6 years ago and had been practicing since. Veth Oron was, I should describe him. He was tall for a Velhari adult male. I had learned by then, which meant his uppermost pair of limbs, when in an upright posture, cleared my desk by a comfortable margin. His carapace was dark at the crown, almost a deep navy, and lighter along the midline, the blue-gray that I had come to recognize as the most common coloring in the transit records. His amber eyes were, as Dav had said, very large. They moved precisely. He told me, through Sorveth, that he was the cluster leader for what remained of the Drevon 4 Transit Authority, that before the thermal event, the station had maintained approximately 8,000 registered inhabitants. That of those 8,000, he believed approximately 4,000 had successfully evacuated before the event rendered the station uninhabitable. He did not know where the other 4,000 had gone. He was trying to find out. I pulled up the queue. I pulled up the family cluster data. I ran the point of origin filter on Drevon 4. I found 312 applications from Drevon 4 in the current queue, of which 198 had been processed and placed, and 114 were pending. I showed him the numbers. I told him that I could not account for Velhari who had not filed applications with the UAEN corridor, that some portion of the missing 4,000 might have found evacuation routes through other compact members, or through independent transport, or through routes I had no visibility into. He listened to the translation. He looked at the numbers on my screen. His amber eyes tracked the columns with the focused precision I had noticed in the transfer queues, the same quality of reading and computing that the Velhari adults seemed to apply to any new information. Then he said something that Sorveth did not immediately translate. She took a moment first. I had the sense she was finding the right standard word for something. He says, she told me, that he did not know the allocation was this large. I told him the standard allocation had been 300 berths, that I had filed a Category 6 trigger on my second day. She translated, he listened, he said something else. He asked, Sorveth said, why you did that. I thought about this question for a moment. I have thought about it since many times. Tell him it was the correct protocol application, I said. Tell him the criteria were met. She translated, he was quiet, then he asked another question. He says, was this your decision alone? Yes. Another silence. He says he would like to know your name. Colhoun, I said, Sira Colhoun. He repeated it. The Velhari phonology shaped it slightly differently. The hard L became something softer, the stress moved. But it was close. He said something further, something longer, and Sorveth was quiet for a moment again. He says the word in his language for what you did, she told me. I will try to translate. It is not a word for a person who does a generous thing. It is a word for a person who does the thing that, he says, was the thing that was always supposed to be done, and that everyone else forgot was supposed to be done. He says there is a different word for that. He says he would like your permission to use that word for you. I said he could use whatever word he liked. He said it. I did not ask Sorveth to translate it. I wanted to leave it as it was, a sound in a language I did not speak, carrying a weight I did not need to have translated to understand. Veth Oron held my gaze for a moment after he said it. Not a human gaze. The compound amber eyes did not track the same way human eyes track, but there was a quality of attention in it, a deliberateness, that communicated something that did not need a translator. He had been cluster leader of Drevon 4. He had kept the register of 8,000 people. He was now keeping the register of 4,000, and the register was still incomplete, and he was going to spend the rest of his life finishing it, and he was standing in my office telling me a word that meant something I did not have in standard. He left. I went back to the queue. The queue was not going down as fast as I needed it to go, and I knew why. The Kethvaz corridor closures were accelerating. What had begun as a systematic pressure was now, by the information coming in through the CRD regional network, something faster and more total. 3 more corridor stations had been declared uninhabitable in the past 10 days. The wave of applications was not cresting, it was still rising. I had 41 transports running the corridor route plus the Meridian Covenant on station, and I was processing faster than any single allocation desk I was aware of had ever processed, and the math was not closing. I called Havern. I told him I needed more transport tonnage. I told him the Category 6 deployment was now clearly insufficient to address the scope of displacement, and I was formally requesting authorization to expand the manifest to include Corridor 9's relief reserve, which I had identified as currently underutilized and theoretically available. Havern said he would raise it with the board. I said the board met quarterly. He said he understood. I said that people were dying. He said he understood. I said I was going to file an emergency expansion request under Category 6 Provision Subclause 9, which allowed the triggering clerk to request emergency manifest expansion directly to the UAEN Relief Coordinator's office, bypassing the regional board, in cases where ongoing displacement represented an imminent species-level threat. He said he was not aware of Subclause 9. I told him it was on page 47 of the Allocation Protocol document, Section 12, Paragraph 3. There was a long silence. "Callhound," he said, "are you reading the protocols trying to find things to do, or are you reading them trying to find permission for things you've already decided to do?" I thought about this honestly. "Both," I said. He made a sound that was not quite a laugh and not quite a sigh. "File the Subclause 9. I'll make sure it gets to the right desk." The emergency expansion came through in 31 hours. 11 additional transports from the Corridor 9 Reserve. Total manifest, 52 ships plus the Meridian Covenant. Dav, when I told him, put his head down on the desk for a moment. "I've been doing this job for 8 weeks, he said, his voice muffled by the desk surface. "You're doing fine," I said. "The compliance officer called me," he said. "She asked me to characterize the allocation environment in my work unit." "What did you tell her?" "I told her it was extremely compliant." I went back to the queue. Compliance officer, her name was Tresk, Deputy Compliance Officer Lena Tresk, came to my office on day 28. She had the look of someone who had been handed a situation that did not fit neatly into any of her existing categories and was determined to be professionally thorough about it regardless. She had a tablet with the full action log from the Category 6 filing forward, and she walked me through it item by item. The initial trigger, the Category 3 medical reclassifications, the Corridor 7 reserve activation, the Meridian Covenant requisition, the Subclause 9 emergency expansion, the Corridor 9 reserve integration. She asked me, at each step, to identify the specific protocol provision I was relying on. I identified it at each step, because I had found it and read it and documented it before I had acted on it, every time. I had kept the documentation because I had understood from the first morning that I was going to be asked for it. At the end of the walkthrough, Tresk looked at her tablet for a moment without speaking. "You built this in sequence," she said finally. "Each action was predicated on the one before it." "Yes." "And you documented each predicate before acting." "Yes." "Callhound," she said, and her voice had something in it I could not quite classify, not approval, not quite. Something more complicated. "This is technically within protocol." "I know. The regional board is going to have opinions about it." "I know. And the Transport Directorate, and the Medical Corps Liaison's chain of command, and the Corridor 9 Reserve Authority." "I expect so." She looked at me. "Are you worried?" I thought about the queue. I thought about the number at the top and the number at the bottom and the gap between them. I thought about the thermal event reports. I thought about the cluster codes with the missing members. Not particularly, I said. She closed her tablet. She was quiet for a moment. Then she said, "There is one thing I need to tell you." Yes. The Keth Vaz sent a second communication this morning, not to the station commander, to the Compact Humanitarian Office directly. They are formally requesting that the Compact compel Caravan Station to suspend intake and return all Velhari transit documentation to Keth Vaz administrative custody for verification purposes. I understood what verification purposes meant, so did she. The Compact's response, I asked. Pending, she said. They have 30 days to respond under the Compact Charter. 30 days. The queue was currently at 2,100 and dropping, but the incoming rate was still running above my processing rate at peak. 30 days was a very long time. Then I need to accelerate the pace, I said. Tresk looked at me. Callhound, if the Compact issues a compliance order, you will need to stop. Yes. You understand that? Yes. She looked at me for another moment. Whatever she was looking for, I don't know if she found it. She left without another word. I turned back to the queue and began working at a pace I had not attempted before. I extended my own shift to 20 hours. I pulled in 2 additional Grade 4 clerks from the station's general administrative pool and trained them on the allocation protocols in a single 8-hour session, the essential protocols, the ones that mattered for this specific work. I restructured the processing workflow so that the biometric verifications ran in parallel with the health declaration checks rather than sequentially, cutting our per-application processing time by roughly 18%. I told Dav to hand off the cluster cross-reference to one of the new clerks and come back to primary processing. He did it without complaint. He also, without being asked, began working through his breaks. On day 31, he came to my desk at what should have been the end of his shift and did not leave. I looked up from my terminal at around 2200 and found him still at his station, running the medical priority queue, the overhead light giving his face a drawn quality that I had not seen on him before. Go sleep, I said. He shook his head, not defiantly, he just shook it. Dav. There's a cluster in the current batch, he said, without looking up from his screen. Cluster 14 Gamma, 8-member unit, point of origin Velhari Station Sarath 9. I've been tracking them for 2 weeks. The cluster leader filed the original application on day 3. 6 members cleared through on day 19. He stopped. And the other 2, I asked. Filed an update this morning. They're on the incoming Corridor 7 shuttle. They board in 4 hours. He finally looked up. If I process their updated application right now, I can flag them for the Meridian Covenant's next intake and they will clear before the shuttle docks. The cluster leader will know before the shuttle airlocks open. All 8 of them will know. He looked at me. He had been keeping this particular thread alive for 19 days. Then process it, I said. He turned back to his screen. His hands were moving before I finished the sentence. I watched him work for a moment. He was not the Grade 3 clerk who had arrived 6 weeks ago asking where to file his station transfer acknowledgement forms. He was something else by now. I did not have a category for it yet. I went back to my own queue. At 2:14 station time, he appeared at the side of my desk. Done, he said. Good. She'll know in 8 minutes, the cluster leader. I sent the confirmation to her resettlement address. Good, I said again. He went back to his station. I went back to mine. Neither of us said anything else about it. The 30 days passed faster than I had thought possible and slower than I needed them to. The Compact's response to the Keth Vaz second communication arrived on day 36. The rhythm of those weeks is hard to describe from the inside. Outside it, looking back, I can see the shape of it. The way the manifest expanded in increments, the way the queue grew faster than I could drain it and then slowed and then grew again, the way the docking bay feeds became something I checked with the same habitual regularity I checked the queue numbers. But inside it at the time, there was only the next application, the next cluster, the next health declaration to verify, the next birth assignment to make. What I noticed over time was the families. In allocation work, you do not usually see the people behind the documents. You see the documents. That is, in a professional sense, the correct way to do it. It is faster. It is more consistent. It does not introduce the kinds of emotional distortions that slow processing and introduce error. But the docking bay feed was on my second monitor, and I found I could not make myself turn it off. I watched the Velhari families come through the airlocks. I had learned by then to read some of what the cluster codes meant in practical terms. A cluster of 2 adults and 3 subadults was a nuclear family in the Velhari reckoning. A cluster of 6 or more adults was a multi-generational unit, an extended family that had traveled together, which meant they had been together when whatever happened to their station happened. The clusters that came through with missing members, adult pairs with no subadults, subadults traveling with non-parental adults, those were the ones you could identify from the cluster data, and once you knew how to read it, you could not unread it. Dav learned to read it too. By the 4th week, he had stopped having to be told to prioritize the medical queue. He just did it. He flagged the cases that needed Meridian Covenant assignment before I had to ask. He started tracking the Drevon 4 applications separately, the ones Veth Oron's cluster had asked about, pulling them forward in the processing order when they came in. They're a community, he told me one evening. Even separated, they're still organized. They're tracking each other. I keep seeing the same cluster leader codes across multiple applications. People who registered themselves as belonging to the same home cluster, even though they're arriving on different ships. It's how they kept count, I said, before, on the stations. The cluster system is a census methodology. They brought their census with them, he said. Yes. He was quiet a moment. That's not nothing. No, I said, it's not nothing. The compact's response to the Keth Va's second communication arrived on day 36. It was not a compliance order. It was a formal acknowledgement that the caravan station resettlement operation fell within the humanitarian authority provisions of the Compact Charter, and that no member signatory had standing to compel the suspension of Compact-authorized humanitarian operations, absent a full council vote, which the Compact was not prepared to convene for the purpose of addressing what it characterized as a bilateral corridor administrative matter. The Keth Va's objections were noted for the record. I forwarded the response to Havern, to Tresk, and to the station legal office. Then I looked at the queue. It was 890 names. I could close it. If the incoming rate held, if the Corridor 9 reserve held, if the Meridian Covenant stayed on station, I could close it. I called Vin. Keep the ships running, I said. All of them, every run they can make. How much longer, he asked. Until the queue is empty. On day 39, Veth Oron came back to my office. He brought Sorvith again, and he brought an older Velhari woman who was introduced as the administrative lead of the Velhari Transit Authority in exile. Her name, in translation, meant something close to the one who keeps the register. I wrote it in my log as Velsoran, the name she used in standard. Velsoran had, she told me through Sorvith, been maintaining the Velhari population register since the corridor evacuations began. She had a full accounting. She told me the number of Velhari who had passed through caravan stations manifest to that point was 9,847. She told me that the number she was still tracking in unconfirmed transit, still in the corridor, still displaced, still trying to reach a compact station, was approximately 1,400. How many can your remaining manifest absorb? She asked. I ran the numbers. If I hold the current reserve allocation and the corridor 9 extensions, close to 1,600. She and Veth Oron exchanged a look, not a human exchange of glances, the Velhari equivalent, a specific angular orientation of the upper pair of eyes while the lower pairs remained forward-focused. I had learned to read it, a little. Sorvith translated something. She says that is enough. I said, I know. The last convoy came in on day 47. I know this partly from my log and partly from memory, and the two sources agree on the facts though they describe them differently. The log says, Final Velhari Primary Corridor Convoy, 11 vessels, 1,365 passengers, cleared for approach 1704 station time, docking complete 1923, processing transferred to Resettlement Coordination 2117. The memory is less neat than that. I was at the bay this time. I had been there before over the course of those 47 days, but not consistently. The desk was where the work was and the bay was where the ships were, and on most days the work kept me at the desk. But I had been tracking the final convoy's approach since morning, and when the docking notifications started coming through, I closed my terminal and went down. The bay was busy. Caravan Station had developed a processing rhythm over 7 weeks that I had not anticipated being able to build in 7 weeks, and watching it work was, I do not have a word for it that doesn't veer toward a sentiment that would embarrass me to write down. It worked. The station health personnel were in position. The documentation teams were at their stations. The transfer queues were marked out. Dav was there with his tablet, with the cluster codes open, already cross-referencing the incoming manifests against his tracking list. The Velhari came off the ships. They moved through the airlocks in the quiet, deliberate way I had watched on the feeds for 7 weeks, adults keeping 2 limbs on the children, the full stop on the first solid deck step, the amber eyes reading the space. The bay lights were on full. I had made sure of that, because the Velhari photoreceptors had a different range than human eyes, and the station's standard docking illumination was slightly below what made the space clearly readable to them. One cluster came off the third transport and stopped in a tight group just inside the airlock threshold. 7 adults, 4 subadults, all with the same cluster identifier on their biometric tags. Complete. An intact multi-generational unit, 11 members all present. I watched one of the adults reach out without not looking, because he did not need to, and place a lower limb along the nearest subadult's back. A gesture that did not have a word in standard. I looked for it in the documentation later. There's a Velhari term that Sorvith had explained to me early in the operation when I had asked her about the cluster codes, and what they meant practically. The adult responsibility obligation that the cluster system encoded, the way the census function and the family function were not separable in Velhari social organization, the way the register was not a bureaucratic record, but something closer to what the word meant, in translation. The ongoing proof that you still exist. The cluster of 11 stood at the airlock threshold. The subadults pressed close to the adults. The amber eyes were moving across the bay, the ceiling, the lights, the documentation tables, the caravan personnel in gray jackets, the calculation being computed. Then the cluster leader, the oldest adult, by plating coloring, the slate having gone almost white at the crown, moved forward. The first solid deck step. He set all 6 limbs on the station floor and did not stop. The others followed. The Meridian Covenant's ramp was the last thing I was watching. The hospital ship had a lower dock than the transports. The Meridian Covenant's main intake ramp came down at a shallower angle to accommodate patients on stretchers, patients in mobility aids, patients who could not walk the steeper gangways of the standard transports. In the weeks of the operation, it had become the place the most difficult cases came through, the elderly, the unwell, the clustering complete families, the ones who had been in transit longest and showed it. A family came down that ramp near the end of the processing. I do not know their names, they were in the final batch, and by that point I was watching, not clerking, and the names are in Dav's log rather than mine. 2 adults, amber eyes wide in the bay lights, 6 limbs moving in the careful way that I now recognized as the Velhari form of exhausted but controlled. Between them, 4 subadults in 2 pairs, each pair with an adult limb resting across the upper carapace. The smallest of the 4 subadults, the youngest by size, had a carapace coloring that was lighter than the adults, still coming in, not yet the full blue-gray of an adult Velhari. The color of the outer drift stations in the light spectrum photographs I had seen in the transit files. The color of somewhere that no longer existed. They stopped at the bottom of the ramp, all 6 of them, the first solid deck step. The adult on the right, one of the parents, reached out with a lower limb and touched the deck. Just touched it, the way you might test a surface you were not certain would hold. It held. I watched them move through into the processing queue. I watched them stop at the documentation table, where one of the health clerks was running the biometric confirmation. I watched the health clerk finish the scan and reach forward and set a routing band on the smallest subadult's upper limb. A green band, which was the caravan system for full family unit, no medical holds, cleared for resettlement transfer. Green. All 6 of them. I stood there until the last of the final convoy had cleared the ramp and the bay lights had been brought down to standard docking levels, and the Meridian Covenant's ramp had been raised and secured. The documentation team was packing up. Dav was finishing his cross-reference. He came and stood next to me. 11,212, he said, final count. I said nothing. He looked at his tablet. I watched him close the cluster tracking file. He had opened it on day 14, when he had noticed the incomplete clusters in the queue data, and asked me if he could build a lookup table. He had kept it running for 33 days. The last entry, Cluster 14 Gamma, 8 members, all present, had been closed 11 days ago, the morning after he had sat at his station until past midnight to flag the incoming shuttle transfer before the cluster leader's notification was due. He pressed a single key. The file closed. The first convoy, he said, came in on a ship that needed 2 hull patches before it could undock again. The manifest had 47 names on it. You stamped them through in 4 minutes. I had forgotten that. The 4 minutes, I mean. The last one, he said, had 1,365. Took 6 hours to fully process. The team has gotten faster, I said. The team, he said, has gotten very good at this very specific thing. I did not say anything else for a moment. The bay was quiet now, the background noise of 7 weeks of convoys gone, the specific acoustics of an empty dock asserting themselves. Metal and air. Havern called, Dav said. Regional Board has concluded its review. Provisional finding. The Category 6 trigger stands as valid. The asset deployments are, he used the phrase, within extraordinary parameters. They're going to write it up as a new case study for the protocol documentation. Good, I said. Tresk filed a commendation. I looked at him. She did, he said. I saw it. She filed it with the Directorate's Grade Review Board. She cited exceptional creative protocol application in a humanitarian emergency context. Creative, I repeated. That's the word she used. I looked at the Meridian Covenant's berth at the place where the ramp had been. The dock was empty. The lights were low. Dav, I said, go file the final processing report. Yes, ma'am. And find out if the Resettlement Coordination Office needs any additional documentation on the cluster tracking. Already sent them a copy. Good. He went, I stayed. This is the thing I have spent years trying to articulate, and I am not sure I have ever gotten it right. I am not a person who is given to large feelings, or rather I am a person who has learned, over a career spent in allocation work, to keep the large feelings appropriately categorized, to know where they are and to go back to them later when the queue is empty and the work is done. The queue was empty. The work was done. 11,212 names. I had filed the Category 6 trigger on day 1. I had not known, when I filed it, whether it would hold. I had not known whether the board would reverse it, whether Havern would find a mechanism to freeze the manifest, whether the Kethvaz protests would produce a compact response that shut the operation down. I had known that the criteria were met, and that the protocol provision existed, and that someone at a grade 7 or above had to file it, and the someone was me. I stood in the empty dock for a while. The log entry I made that night is businesslike and accurate, the way my log entries always are. It records the final convoy, the final count, the status of the regional board review, the commendation filing, the transfer of active cases to the resettlement coordination team. It does not record what I thought about while I stood in the empty dock. I made a separate note, outside the official log, on paper. I still keep a paper journal, a habit I acquired from a supervisor in my second posting who told me that some things deserve a slower medium. The note I wrote says, "The ramp was still warm when they raised it." That is all it says. I am aware that this is not, as a piece of writing, particularly illuminating. But I remember it, the specific temperature of the dock air, the faint thermal signature of the Meridian Covenant's intake ramp still visible on the deck surface where it had rested, and the family with the subadult in the outer drift colors, and the green bands, and the way the smallest one had walked up the ramp without stopping. You do not stop, after all, when the surface has already been tested. The surface held. For all 11,212 of them, the surface held. I closed my log, put on my jacket, and walked back to my office. In the morning there would be follow-up documentation to file. There always is. But that night the dock was quiet and the ramp was raised and the ships were full, and that was the count. 300 berths. That was what the allocation said. 11,212. That was what the allocation did.